When I came home that evening, the house was eerily quiet. It wasn't unusual for Molly to be out, maybe running errands or meeting friends, but something about the silence felt different. I called out her name, expecting to hear her voice echo back, but all I got in return was the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. I checked my phone, and there were no messages or missed calls. Maybe she was caught up in traffic. I sat on the couch, but as the minutes turned into an hour, my unease began to grow. It wasn't like her to just disappear without a word, especially when she knew I'd be home from work soon. I sent her a quick text, something casual, "Hey, where are you?" But the message remained unread. It was then I started to feel the first pangs of dread. I walked through the house, half expecting to find a note somewhere, something explaining her absence. I checked the kitchen counter, the dining table, and the usual places where she'd leave messages or reminders. But there was nothing. I moved to the bedroom, expecting maybe she'd left some sort of clue. The bed was neatly made, the closet doors slightly ajar, but nothing out of the ordinary. Except for one detail, her suitcase was missing. That was when the knot in my stomach tightened. Molly's suitcase wasn't something she'd just take for a quick trip to the grocery store or a night out with friends. It was the kind of suitcase you pack when you're going somewhere far, for more than just a day. My heart started to race as I quickly opened the closet, scanning her side. Several of her clothes were gone, enough for a longer trip. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my mind racing with questions. Where had she gone? Why hadn't she told me? My fingers fumbled as I tried calling her again, but it went straight to voicemail. Her phone was off. That was when panic truly began to set in. This wasn't a simple miscommunication. This was something bigger, something I couldn't quite wrap my mind around yet. I forced myself to think rationally. Maybe she left for some emergency? Family trouble? But no one had called me about anything urgent. I scrolled through my recent calls, checking if I'd missed anything. There were no signs, no red flags leading up to this moment. Everything had seemed fine, at least, on the surface. After what felt like hours of pacing the room, I turned to her laptop on the desk. Molly wasn't one to leave it behind when she traveled, but there it was, still plugged in and open. I hesitated. We respected each other's privacy, but the gnawing uncertainty pushed me over the edge. I sat down, opened the lid, and woke the screen. Her emails were open. Nothing strange at first glance, work stuff, personal messages, some promotions. But then I saw it, a flight confirmation. My breath caught as I clicked on it. A flight to New Orleans was booked 2 days ago. Departure, this morning. My pulse quickened as I stared at the screen. Why New Orleans? And more importantly, why hadn't she told me? My mind raced through possible explanations, but none of them made sense. She'd never mentioned wanting to go there, not recently, at least. I clicked back to her messages, combing through recent conversations, looking for anything that might explain her sudden departure. And then I found it, a series of texts exchanged with someone I didn't recognize. The tone of the messages was casual at first, then increasingly familiar, too familiar. My hands began to shake as I scrolled through. This wasn't a work colleague or a casual acquaintance. This was something else. The name at the top of the conversation was Tony. My chest tightened. I kept reading, piecing together a narrative I didn't want to believe. Late-night conversations, references to meeting up, plans to see each other again. And there it was, the final nail in the coffin. Can't wait to see you in New Orleans. I'll be waiting for you after the show. My stomach churned. Molly had left me. Without a word, without an explanation. She had packed her bags and flown off to New Orleans to meet some man named Tony. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless and stunned. I couldn't move. My mind refused to process what was right in front of me. She was gone, and she wasn't coming back. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, images, and questions. Why New Orleans? Who was Tony? And more importantly, what was Molly doing with him? I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the fragments of information I'd found. But no matter how I twisted it, the conclusion was inescapable. Something was wrong. The next morning, exhaustion tugging at me, I decided to dig deeper. I couldn't just sit and wait for answers to fall into my lap. If Molly wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd have to find it myself. I opened her laptop again, this time with a clear goal. I needed to know who Tony was, how long this had been going on, and just how deep her betrayal ran. I started by searching for his name, Tony Robbins. At first, I wasn't sure what I'd find. Maybe a regular guy, maybe someone she met online. But the results surprised me. Tony Robbins wasn't just some random man, he was a well-known jazz musician. A quick search revealed articles, interviews, and videos. He was a rising star in the jazz scene, performing regularly in New Orleans at some of the most prestigious clubs. He had a reputation for his soulful trumpet playing, his charisma on stage, and his passionate performances. My heart sank as I scrolled through pictures of him. Tall, with an easy charm and the kind of confidence that radiated from the screen. I imagined him on stage, surrounded by adoring fans, with Molly sitting somewhere in the front row, watching him with the same look she used to give me. The realization hit me like a freight train. She wasn't just running off with some random guy. She was infatuated with a celebrity, someone who could offer her excitement and glamour. A world I didn't belong to. And suddenly, everything started to make sense. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the distant looks she gave me when I asked her about her day. She had been living a double life, and I had been blind to it. I kept digging and searching through social media accounts and old messages. The more I found, the more it felt like my world was unraveling. Molly had been meeting Tony for months, slipping away under the guise of work trips or visits to friends. It wasn't just casual flings, it was something more. They dined at high-end restaurants, spent evenings together after his performances, and shared moments that I should have been a part of. I could see them clearly in my mind, sitting in dimly lit jazz clubs, sipping wine, exchanging flirtatious glances while the music played softly in the background. The texts between them told the rest of the story. Their relationship had blossomed around his performances. She admired his talent and his passion for music. Tony, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on her attention. He wasn't just another musician playing for the crowd, he was playing for her. They shared something special, something that transcended the everyday life we had back in Houston. The messages were filled with excitement about their secret rendezvous. She had been to his concerts, met him backstage, and even dined with him afterward. They talked about the thrill of sneaking around, the electricity of their stolen moments. They had planned more trips and more secret nights together, and it made my blood boil. I stared at my screen, numb with disbelief. I could almost hear the music playing in the background of their conversations, the jazz melodies that had become the soundtrack to their affair. Molly wasn't just having an affair, she was living a different life with him. A life where she was part of his world, part of the music and the glamour. And I was left behind, blindsided by the fantasy she'd fallen into. But the worst part? The messages weren't just about sex or passion. They were intimate, filled with affection, inside jokes, and personal confessions. It was clear that Tony wasn't just some passing fling. He was someone she cared about, someone she was emotionally connected to. She hadn't just left me for excitement or a brief escape, she had left me for a different life, a life with him. As I sat there, staring at the screen, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness, and a deep, gnawing emptiness. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had built a life with, had been lying to me for months. And now, she was in New Orleans, living a life that didn't include me. I imagined them together, her in the audience, watching him play, feeling the music flow through her as he performed just for her. And then afterward, walking hand in hand through the French Quarter, laughing, sharing quiet moments in hidden corners of the city. They had stolen something from me, something I couldn't get back. Tony wasn't just some fling. He was the reason she left. And now I knew. The weight of it all settled on my chest, squeezing like a vice. Betrayal has a way of consuming you. It's not just about the lies or the cheating, it's about the trust that's shattered, the life you thought you had. I felt like a fool. The woman I had shared my dreams with, the woman I had trusted implicitly, had been living another life with another man. It wasn't just the physical distance between us that hurt. It was the emotional betrayal, the realization that while I had been home, working, planning our future, she had been with him, Tony Robbins. A wave of nausea hit me as I pictured them together. Every detail was vivid in my mind. Molly laughing at his jokes, touching his arm, looking at him with that same smile she once reserved for me. I imagined their nights together, in those dimly lit jazz clubs, where music filled the air and emotions ran high. But the worst part, the part that tore at my insides, was that she had chosen him, chosen his world over ours. Rage bubbled up inside me, hot and uncontrollable. I wanted to tear everything apart, to scream, to make them both feel the same pain they had inflicted on me. But no matter how much I wanted to lash out, I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Acting on impulse would only lead to disaster. And despite the overwhelming hurt and anger, I knew I had to be smart about this. I needed to be strategic, cold, and calculating. I forced myself to sit down, taking deep breaths, trying to calm the storm inside me. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. If Molly thought she could walk away from our life without consequence, if she thought she could replace me with some jazz musician, she was wrong. I'd make sure she regretted every moment she spent with him. And as for Tony, the man who thought he could take my wife and get away with it, he had no idea what was coming. As the anger simmered into a cold resolve, I knew what I had to do. There would be no shouting matches and no confrontations at our front door. No, my response had to be as public as their betrayal. I had to hit them where it hurt, Tony's career and Molly's reputation. They thought they could build this fantasy life together, basking in their secret romance, but I was about to tear that apart. I started by looking up Tony's upcoming performances. It didn't take long to find out that he had a concert in just a few days at one of the biggest jazz venues in New Orleans. It was perfect. Tony was riding high, his reputation growing with every show. His name on the lips of fans and critics alike. He was the rising star of the jazz scene, but I was going to make sure that his star fell hard. I bought a ticket to his concert that night. No VIP access, no backstage pass. I wanted to be just another face in the crowd, waiting for the perfect moment. My plan wasn't fully formed yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I was going to disrupt his performance, destroy the image he had carefully cultivated, and expose the affair he and Molly had been hiding. I started imagining how it would go down. The spotlight would be on him, the audience captivated by his music, and then I'd step forward, tearing the facade apart. I could already see the shock on Tony's face, the confusion in the audience, and Molly's horror when she realized what was happening. She might think she's safe in his world, hidden away in the shadows, but I was going to drag her and Tony into the harsh light of reality. But I wasn't going to rush. I couldn't afford any mistakes. Every step had to be planned. I began gathering evidence, screenshots of their texts, social media posts, and anything that would serve as proof of their affair. If I was going to make a scene, I needed to make sure there was no denying what they had done. The truth was my weapon, and I was going to wield it like a blade. I spent hours practicing what I would say, rehearsing the words that would land like a hammer blow. I wanted it to be quick and devastating, no room for escape, no room for explanation. I imagined the moment when I'd stand up, interrupt the music, and lay it all bare. The look on Tony's face as his perfect world came crashing down. The gasps from the audience. The whispers of disbelief would ripple through the crowd. And Molly, God, I could already see the panic in her eyes as she realized that her little fantasy was over. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to ruin them, publicly, for everyone to see. The night of the concert, I arrived early. The streets of New Orleans buzzed with life. Music spilling out from every corner, but none of it registered. I had only one focus, tonight's performance, Tony Robbins on stage, and Molly. My Molly, sitting in the audience, soaking it all in. I found my seat near the back of the dimly lit venue, just another face among the crowd, but my heart pounded like a drum in my chest. I scanned the room, my eyes searching for her. And there she was, in the front row, looking every bit like she belonged. Her hair was perfectly styled, her dress elegant, as if she were some kind of VIP. She sat there, completely enraptured, her eyes glued to the stage where Tony stood, trumpet in hand, like a god among men. I couldn't help but stare at her, my mind spinning. There she was, the woman I'd shared my life with, looking at him with the same adoration she once had for me. I could see it in her eyes, the excitement, the admiration. It wasn't just a casual fling, this was something deeper. And the worst part was, she didn't even look guilty. There was no remorse, no hesitation. She was living her fantasy without a care in the world. Tony began to play, his trumpet filling the room with smooth, soulful notes. The audience was spellbound, swaying to the rhythm, lost in the music. But all I felt was a rising tide of anger. Every note he played, every smile he cast toward Molly, only fueled the fire burning inside me. How could they both sit there, so smug, so confident, while I sat in the shadows, my life in ruins? Their eyes met. From my vantage point, I saw it. Molly's gaze locked onto Tony's as he played, a private moment in a room full of people. That was it, the final straw. I couldn't sit there any longer. I had planned to wait for the perfect moment, to time my intervention precisely, but all that went out the window when I saw the way she looked at him like he was her whole world. I stood up, my heart racing, and started moving toward the stage. My footsteps felt heavy, each step filled with the weight of everything they had stolen from me. As I neared the front, people began to notice, their heads turning as I walked past them, but I didn't care. I had one goal, and nothing was going to stop me. Tony was in the middle of a solo when I reached the stage. I didn't hesitate. I climbed up, ignoring the gasps and murmurs from the audience, and strode right toward him. The music faltered for a split second as Tony glanced at me, confused. But I wasn't looking at him. My eyes were locked on Molly. I grabbed the microphone. The band stopped playing, the air suddenly thick with tension as the crowd fell into a stunned silence. Tony stared at me, bewildered, and Molly's face drained of color as she realized what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady but cold, "I'm sorry to interrupt your evening. But there's something you all need to know." The room was dead silent now, all eyes on me. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, but I wasn't going to stop. This was my moment, my chance to expose them for what they truly were. "This man you all came to see, this so-called brilliant musician, is a fraud," I said, my voice rising with every word. "And that woman sitting there in the front row? That's my wife, Molly Jenkins." A ripple of confusion spread through the audience, but I kept going. "For months, they've been sneaking around behind my back, living out their little fantasy while destroying my life. Molly and Tony have been having an affair, hiding in the shadows, thinking they could get away with it. Well, not anymore." I turned to face Tony, who stood frozen, his face pale. "You think you can just take what's mine? You think you can steal my wife and pretend like it doesn't matter?" Molly had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. She stood up, but it was too late. I was already in the thick of it, and I wasn't about to let either of them off the hook. "This man, this homewrecker," I spat, pointing at Tony, "has destroyed my family. And you," I turned to Molly, my voice shaking with emotion. "You chose this. You chose to throw away everything we had for this." The crowd was buzzing now, whispers and gasps filling the room. People were pulling out their phones, recording everything. I could see flashes from the cameras, and hear the murmurs growing louder as the reality of the situation set in. Tony finally found his voice. "Hey, man, you need to calm down," he started, stepping forward, but I cut him off. "Calm down?" I barked, my voice cracking with anger. "You think I'm going to calm down after what you did? Do you think you can just play your music, smile for the cameras, and pretend like none of this matters? You've ruined my life, and now I'm going to ruin yours." I turned back to the audience. "This man isn't some hero, some musical genius. He's a liar, a cheat, and he's been sleeping with my wife. So if you came here tonight to idolize him, to worship his talent, just know that you're supporting a man who has no respect for anyone but himself." The venue was in chaos now. People were shouting, some standing up, others recording. The whole room buzzing with the shock of the revelation. I could see security moving toward the stage, but I wasn't finished. I turned to Molly one last time, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I hope it was worth it, Molly. I hope he was worth destroying everything we had." And with that, I dropped the microphone, the sound echoing through the stunned room. Security finally reached me, their hands on my arms as they began to pull me away, but I didn't resist. I had said what I came to say. The damage was done. As I was dragged out of the venue, I caught one last glimpse of Tony and Molly standing there, frozen in the spotlight. Their perfect little world was falling apart, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The scandal was out, and there was no going back. The fallout from that night was immediate and brutal. By the time I got back to my hotel room, the internet was already buzzing with what had happened at Tony Robbins' concert. Videos of my outburst had gone viral, clips of me standing on stage, exposing the affair in front of the packed venue, were being shared on every social media platform. News outlets were picking up the story, framing it as a dramatic scandal that rocked the jazz world. At first, it was local gossip sites and jazz blogs that started the conversation, but within hours, the mainstream media had latched onto it too. Headlines blared across my phone screen as I scrolled through the chaos. Jazz sensation Tony Robbins exposed in public scandal. Secret affair with married woman ends in concert meltdown. And Tony Robbins' career on the line after explosive revelation. The more I read, the more I realized that the story was no longer just about my betrayal. It had morphed into something much bigger. Tony Robbins was no longer just a jazz musician. He was now a public figure with a tarnished reputation. The jazz community, especially in New Orleans, reacted swiftly. Jazz was built on authenticity, on deep-rooted respect for the art, and Tony's involvement in such a scandal was seen as a stain on that reputation. His talent wasn't enough to shield him from the consequences of his actions. Promoters began canceling his upcoming shows. Festivals he had been scheduled to headline quietly removed his name from the lineup. One by one, the doors that had been wide open for Tony began to close. Social media was brutal. Fans who had once idolized him were turning their backs, many of them expressing their disappointment in angry tweets and scathing comments. Some condemned him for his lack of integrity, while others simply couldn't reconcile the romanticized image of a soulful jazz musician with the reality of a man embroiled in an ugly affair. Every tweet, every post was another nail in the coffin of his public image. But it wasn't just the fans. His peers, fellow musicians, and industry insiders began to distance themselves from him as well. No one wanted to be associated with the scandal that now defined his name. Jazz clubs that once clamored to book him suddenly found reasons to pull his gigs. Sponsors who had invested in his growing career quickly dissolved their partnerships. The jazz world, once enamored with his talent, was now shunning him. I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction as I watched his career unravel. He had taken everything from me, my marriage, my sense of security, my future, and now, I was watching him lose everything he had worked for. This wasn't just a moment of public embarrassment, it was a complete dismantling of his career. The media frenzy didn't stop at Tony either. Molly wasn't spared from the public humiliation. Though she wasn't as well known as Tony, the story of the affair quickly spread through our social circles back in Houston. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues all knew what had happened. The whispers and judgment followed her everywhere she went. The life she had built, the life she thought she could keep intact while sneaking away to New Orleans, was crumbling beneath her. For Tony, the scandal wasn't just a passing storm. It was a full-blown hurricane that threatened to destroy everything he had built. He tried to issue a statement, of course. It was the usual damage control, an apology for his poor decisions, a plea for privacy, and an attempt to spin the narrative into one of personal growth. But it didn't land. The public wasn't interested in his redemption arc. They wanted accountability, and no apology was going to erase what had happened on that stage. His attempts to move past the scandal only seemed to fuel more criticism. Every interview he gave, every performance he tried to salvage, was met with skepticism and hostility. Critics who had once praised him now took shots at his character, questioning whether his music had ever been genuine or if he had simply been playing a part, much like he had in his personal life. The scandal had tainted everything, from his relationships to his art. No longer was Tony Robbins the rising star of jazz. Now, he was the man who had been publicly shamed, his career tainted by the affair. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the scandal spread further. His album sales plummeted. Radio stations that had once featured his music began to quietly remove his songs from their rotations. What had once been a meteoric rise to fame had become a rapid and humiliating fall. I followed every update and every new development, watching from afar as his career disintegrated piece by piece. There was no going back for him now. He had built his name on his talent and his image, and now both had been irrevocably damaged. What was once a golden future filled with opportunities had become a wasteland of canceled shows, broken contracts, and disappointed fans. And as I watched it all unfold, I couldn't help but feel that justice had been served. The man who had taken so much from me was now watching his world fall apart, just as he had destroyed mine. After the scandal broke and the dust started to settle, Molly tried to reach out to me. She called, left voicemails, and sent long, emotional texts, all of which I ignored. I wasn't ready to listen to her explanations, her excuses, or whatever half-hearted attempts she had to justify what she had done. She'd destroyed us, and there was no coming back from that. Every time my phone buzzed with her name, a fresh wave of anger and betrayal surged through me. Eventually, she showed up at the house. I knew she would. We'd lived here together for years, and I knew she'd want to talk in person, try to convince me that we could somehow salvage what was left of our marriage. I watched her from the window as she stood on the front porch, hesitating before knocking. It took everything in me to stay calm and to keep my emotions in check. When I opened the door, her face was a mix of regret and desperation. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. "Luke, can we please talk?" Her voice was soft, pleading, but I couldn't bring myself to feel anything but cold indifference. "There's nothing to talk about, Molly," I said, my voice steady, though the pain was still there, just beneath the surface. "You made your choice. You chose him." Tears welled up in her eyes as she stepped closer, trying to reach for me, but I took a step back. I wasn't going to let her play the victim here. She had made her decisions, and now she had to live with them. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake, Luke. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I never wanted to hurt you." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. She didn't want to hurt me? The betrayal, the lies, the months of sneaking around. How could she have thought that wouldn't tear me apart? "It's too late for apologies," I said, shaking my head. "You destroyed everything, Molly. There's no going back from this." She started to sob, her shoulders shaking as she tried to explain herself. She talked about feeling lost, about how Tony had made her feel alive again, how she hadn't meant for it to become what it did. But none of it mattered. I'd heard enough. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, cutting her off mid-sentence. Her eyes widened in shock as if she hadn't expected me to be so decisive. "It's over. We're done." She stood there, frozen, the reality of my words sinking in. I could see the panic in her eyes, the realization that she had well and truly lost me. "Luke, please," she begged, her voice trembling. "We can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can work through it." But I shook my head. "No, Molly, we can't. You've broken something that can't be fixed. I can't trust you. And without trust, there's nothing left." The silence that followed was heavy, the finality of it hanging between us. She looked at me, searching for some sign that I might change my mind, that there was still hope. But there wasn't. I was done. She left that day, and I filed the divorce papers the next week. It wasn't an easy process, divorces never are, but it was necessary. I needed to close that chapter of my life and move on. Our marriage, the life we'd built together, was over. And as painful as it was, I knew it was the only way forward. Molly had made her choices, and now I was making mine. While the end of my marriage played out in private, the consequences for Tony Robbins continued to unfold publicly. The scandal had completely derailed his career. Every day, I saw more headlines detailing the fallout. He had been riding a wave of success before all this. His name was everywhere, and his future in the jazz world had seemed limitless. But now, his reputation was in tatters. First, the major record label that had signed him quietly dropped him from their roster. They didn't want to be associated with the scandal, with the negative press that had surrounded his name. Without their backing, his upcoming album, which had been hotly anticipated, was shelved indefinitely. The sponsors that had once lined up to support him vanished overnight, wanting nothing to do with the toxic cloud of controversy that surrounded him. But it wasn't just the business side of things that fell apart. His concerts, once sold out in major cities, were now being cancelled one by one. Promoters didn't want to risk the bad press that came with his name. And venues pulled out, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone knew were just excuses to cut ties with him. The jazz community, known for being tight-knit, turned its back on him. Musicians who had once admired him now wanted nothing to do with him. The word betrayal was forever tied to his name, and no one in the industry wanted to be associated with that. Social media only made things worse. The videos of my confrontation on stage continued to circulate, and the public couldn't get enough of the drama. Tony tried to stay quiet at first, hoping the storm would blow over, but it didn't. Every time he tried to step back into the spotlight, the backlash was immediate and fierce. Fans who had once adored him now saw him as a symbol of deceit and arrogance. His talent, undeniable as it was, couldn't save him from the wave of public outrage. He tried to make a comeback, issuing a public apology in a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of his career. But it was too little, too late. His words felt hollow, his remorse insincere. The public had already made up their minds, and there was no redemption in sight. The jazz world moved on without him, and Tony Robbins found himself increasingly isolated, A man once on the verge of greatness is now a cautionary tale of how quickly fame can be destroyed by personal failings. The last I heard, Tony had retreated from the public eye entirely. The jazz clubs that once fought to book him were no longer interested. His music was no longer played on the radio. His face no longer appeared in magazines. His name had become synonymous with scandal, with the betrayal of trust and the destruction of lives. In the end, Tony lost everything: his career, his reputation, and whatever future he had hoped to build with Molly. And though I knew it wouldn't bring me true peace, there was some cold comfort in knowing that justice had been served, in knowing that he was suffering the consequences of his actions just as I had suffered from them. In the days following the scandal, I should have felt victorious. I had torn down Tony Robbins' career, publicly humiliated him and Molly, and watched as everything they'd built together crumbled before their eyes. The world knew what they had done to me, and their punishment was swift and harsh. I had planned my revenge meticulously, and it had unfolded exactly as I envisioned. But as I sat in the quiet of my now empty house, it became clear that the triumph I had expected never arrived. At first, there was a sense of satisfaction. A fleeting moment of relief as the headlines rolled in and Tony's downfall became inevitable. I had hit him where it hurt the most: his career, his image, his standing in the jazz world. But after the initial rush of vindication, the feeling began to sour. The emptiness crept in slowly, quietly, until it was all that remained. I thought that watching Tony and Molly suffer would heal something inside of me, that by destroying them, I'd somehow mend the parts of myself that had been shattered. But instead, I felt hollow. I had won, but it wasn't the kind of victory that brought peace. There was no undoing the damage they had done, no reversing the hurt that had burrowed deep into my chest. The satisfaction I had anticipated was nothing more than a mirage, disappearing as soon as I tried to grasp it. The house, once full of warmth and memories, now felt cold and lifeless. Every room reminded me of what had been lost. Molly was gone for good, and so was the life we had built together. I had wanted to hurt her, to make her feel the same pain she had inflicted on me. And I had done that. But now, I was left with the wreckage, standing among the ruins of a life I no longer recognized. There was no joy in this, only a heavy, oppressive weight that pressed down on me with every passing day. I thought about the nights we had spent together, the laughter that had once filled our home, the quiet moments of comfort that now seemed like distant memories. Those moments were gone, replaced by betrayal, lies, and the bitter aftertaste of revenge. I had lost Molly long before I ever stepped onto that stage, but it wasn't until now that the full weight of that loss hit me. She had been my wife, my partner, and now she was just someone I used to know, someone whose name would forever be tied to my darkest moments. As for Tony, his fall from grace didn't bring me the satisfaction I had imagined, either. Watching him lose everything didn't heal the wounds he had caused. It didn't erase the nights I had spent awake, wondering how long the affair had been going on or why I hadn't seen it coming. His ruined career didn't take away the betrayal, didn't soothe the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. In the end, all I had was a hollow victory and the same old pain. People say that revenge is sweet, but they don't talk about the bitterness that comes afterward. The truth is, revenge hadn't fixed anything. It had just left me with more questions, questions about what could have been. About whether I could have done something differently, about whether any of this had been worth it. I had destroyed Tony's career, yes, but in doing so, I had also destroyed a part of myself. The anger that had once driven me now left me feeling adrift, without purpose, without closure. I had spent so much time planning my revenge, consumed by thoughts of retribution, that I hadn't stopped to consider what would happen afterward. Now that the dust had settled, I was left standing in the aftermath. Alone with my thoughts. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the silence was deafening. It wasn't just Molly who was gone. It was the life we had shared, the future we had planned. I had been so focused on destroying Tony that I hadn't realized I was destroying my own life in the process. Sitting there in the stillness, I realized that revenge wasn't the answer I had been searching for. It hadn't given me closure, hadn't brought me peace. Instead, it had left me with a deep sense of regret. A gnawing emptiness that no amount of vengeance could fill. I had won, but at what cost? I had thought that by making them suffer, I could somehow fix what had been broken inside of me. But the truth was, nothing could undo the pain of betrayal, The sense of loss that came from watching everything you thought you knew disappear before your eyes. Molly was gone, Tony was disgraced, and I was left with nothing but the bitter taste of regret. In the end, all I had was the knowledge that I had gotten what I wanted. But it wasn't what I needed. What I needed was healing and forgiveness, something I couldn't find in revenge. The emptiness remained, a constant reminder that some wounds run too deep to be healed by hurting others. As I sat there, staring into the darkness, I realized that moving forward wasn't about revenge. It was about letting go. But letting go, I would soon discover, was far harder than I had ever imagined. In the months following the chaos, life slowly began to shift. Amidst the emptiness, I met someone new, unexpectedly, casually, during a quiet evening at a local cafe. Her name was Emma, and she had a warmth about her that I hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't trying to fix me, and she didn't ask too many questions about my past. We just talked about everything and nothing, and for the first time in a while, I felt something stir inside me that wasn't anger or pain. There was a lightness in her presence, a simplicity that felt both comforting and terrifying. But even as I started to feel something again, I couldn't rush into anything. The scars from Molly's betrayal were still too fresh, and the walls I had built around myself were high and sturdy. Emma didn't push, and I didn't force it. I wasn't ready to dive headfirst into another relationship, not yet. It was strange, knowing that there could be a future with someone else, yet being cautious, even hesitant, to explore it. For now, it was enough just to know that love might still be possible, even if I wasn't ready to fully embrace it.